talked about this sermon, I talked about the conversation of sex, and every time I brought it up, I'd have these sort of nervous perspectives that that's something that we leave in the bedroom, we don't talk about in church. And I am going to remind all of you that might be watching this, that's shameful. In fact, everybody's talking about it. You can't turn on the TV without it being the center of pretty much every plot and drama. And yet the church would be quiet about it. It's in the Bible, and it's full of stories about the misuse of our sexual appetite and our sexual relationships. And we miss the moments where it's just beautiful in its form. Well, when Genesis speaks to that effect, that a husband will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. Now, one flesh symbolizes so much for that relationship. Now, I have to admit, when I was younger, talking about sex, I fit the mold of that typical young Christian teenager. I was a virgin until married. I remember being in high school and trying to save myself to that end, and I enjoyed dating, I enjoyed going out, having a lot of fun, but I was going to save myself from my wife. I will tell you that when I got to college, I was 18, and on our basketball team happened to be a 26-year-old who had come and gone with college at different places, but he played on our basketball team, and he happened to be married. And I remember just on the bus ride, finally looking at him going, "What's it like?" He goes, "What's what like?" And I go, "Sex." See, to me, the verse 25 in Genesis chapter 2, and they were naked and they felt no shame. And I could not grapple with the fact that you could be naked with this person, and that could be anytime you want. So he, of course, would say it's great. And I remember asking questions like, so in other words, you can get done with basketball practice and you can go eat dinner and then you can have sex. Well, yeah. I said, well, so like if you get up and you sleep in one morning and there's nothing going on, you can just say, what do you want to do? We can have sex. Remember, I was 18 and I was on the outside looking in. Years later, we've been at Greenville College. I've done the chaplain for the camp down there, and a number of us as counselors were sitting around a table. Many of us, I was in my late 30s, and others in their 40s and 50s, and we've been married quite a while. We had one grad assistant who was in his early 20s, newlywed, and the conversation came around what it means to be in marriage, and the conversation was a bit humorous when we talked about sex. Of course, one of the counselors who'd been married many years, decades, said, well, you know, at least you can have sex. You're guaranteed to have it on your birthday and your anniversary. And then somebody else joked, and it's the special holidays. And of course, while we're joking and musing, this poor grad assistant turned white as a ghost. And of course, they were newlyweds, and the old adage is that your first year of marriage, you can take a penny every time you have sex and put it in a jar, and they say it'll take 7 years, if not longer, every year after, to every time you have sex, take the penny out and to empty the jar. So we know, of course, there's a lot of humor made to the absence of sex in marriage, that once you have kids, it gets difficult, your time gets strained. I'm going to share some perspective from this biblical relationship that it matters and it's a part of your identity-forming marriage. I want to start, though, with sex outside of marriage. If we're going to paint a picture for what it means and what it is in marriage, we certainly have to start with what culture has sort of decided is acceptable. That sex outside of marriage is just the way things are. You can't wait, it's too difficult, and we know it is, but there's a reason that that ideal is set in place. A couple of things to be mindful of. When we say sex is acceptable outside of marriage because that's just the way it works nowadays and it's contemporary, it's modern, why don't you catch up with the times? My parents would often say, that's what they said about free love in the 60s. That it wasn't a big deal, that when they found out they developed birth control, that actually free love and being able to sleep with people that you chose was more of an adult behavior, and because you weren't going to then have unwanted children by getting somebody pregnant, then it proved you could have that discipline and yet still enjoy yourself with whomever you wanted, whenever you felt like it. That was supposed to be this response to that, even though you could have sex with other people outside of marriage, it wasn't going to throw our society off kilter. And yet, we see that today there are more children born out of wedlock into single parents than ever before. It's quite shocking, really. the 60s and 70s, the free love, it isn't so free after all. The response I give people when they ask me about that, I'll say, well, I need to test it out, so to speak. There's no way of doing that without it being hurtful in some way. Once you've given yourself to that person, now being married almost 20 years, I can't fathom it otherwise. I use a simple illustration though. When somebody says it doesn't seem to impact me, it can be casual sex, or I can move on, and if that relationship doesn't work out. But the more intimate you are physically, it does translate emotionally. And all I have to do to add that illustration is say if somebody came up and punched me as hard as they could, the next time I see that person, I'm gonna duck. And I shared that last week, and I remind us that that's true about sex. How much more is it that you lend yourself so physically and intimately, vulnerably to someone else? It's going to place a mark on your heart and in your life. So that's something that I think we overlook and want to skirt around when we discuss our sexual relationships, and that I can still be right with God and right with the world, and yet I haven't made this commitment of marriage. And what does that mean? That means that I'm going to say before witnesses that before I assume this person's body as my own, that to the world I will have no other. That till death do us part means something. And we know that doesn't make you capable, as Andy Stanley says. It makes you accountable. And that accountability in marriage is important. So sex outside of marriage, a couple of things people don't also realize is worth pointing out. The satisfaction sexually is lower. People who are single have higher risks of health. People who are married actually tend to be happier sexually speaking, and they also happen to be better health. There's this connection with two people that lets you know that you're not alone and that you don't have to go it alone. They actually have studies of people who have casual sex and are found to be more depressed, higher levels of anxiety. And that's because giving themselves to somebody, thinking it could just be for pleasure and they could go about everything else they wanted to do, it doesn't work that way. They find themselves even lonelier. But then, if you get married, what about sex then? It's great at the onset. What gives sex a bad reputation in marriage is that we only hear about when it's not happening, and then marriages are strained. I will tell you, marriage is obligatory. And sometimes people say, well, I shouldn't have to. And I say, well, read 1 Corinthians 7. Paul makes it pretty clear that a man is not to resist his wife if she'd like to have sex with him, and a wife is not to resist her husband if he would like to have sex with her, except for a time of prayer. So I guess if you're laying in bed together and somebody's wanting to make a move, you could say, I'm praying. Hopefully you're not lying, because that'd really be bad. But that is the part of the relationship that makes it marriage. There's so many other attributes of marriage that are very important, but they're also akin to friendship, to working relationships, to just so many other human endeavors. But what makes it intimate and one is symbolic in sex. That you choose to give yourself to this person, to be naked without shame. Now, I know that that's hard. That's difficult for people to look at and say, so what you're saying is we're supposed to have sex. And I say, yeah. They say, well, it doesn't always work out that way. And I'm going to give you a real simple reason why, because you don't schedule it. I know, that's the part where people go, you want me to schedule this? I mean, all of a sudden I'm on a calendar? Yeah. You schedule everything else. You schedule work, you schedule your fun, if you plan something for Friday night, you call friends, you plan who's bringing the drinks, who's bringing the brownies, who's bringing the chips. But you're telling me that because your life is so scheduled everywhere else, you can't look to your spouse, to your husband, or to your wife and say, yeah, it needs to be on every day that starts with T. To most wives, they say, so we can have sex on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Of course, to most men, that means Tuesdays, Thursdays, today, tomorrow, and Saturday and Sunday. You'd be amazed at how many couples have a marriage that is reinvigorated with a intentionality of spending time together. Now you may have to choose how to spend that time. Men and women, because we're so different, we come into this sexual relationship differently as well. So for one, it's very physical, it's a release. For another, it's emotional, it's bonding on an emotional level. So when you plan that time, you make that known to each other. What is it that you need from me? If it's a shoulder massage, then you take time. If it's a conversation, then before you just get at it, you talk to each other about life, about who you are, about your dreams, your aspirations. But ultimately, you do end up with this moment of being naked without shame, becoming one. If you get a chance, the reason the Bible is overlooked on this subject is there's certain books that we sort of take out of the equation. We only know about Leviticus 18 and the inappropriate ways to have sex. But read Song of Solomon. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. Read about the romance. Before Solomon was this old cantankerous writing Ecclesiastes, he is young and in love. Before he has 700 wives and 300 concubines, he is speaking of this one who he points out beyond everyone else is more beautiful and fair. Well, a little review. When is sex bad? Now that has a double meaning. Sex is bad when it's outside of marriage, and it's also not as good as it's supposed to be by habit. It may be fun for the moment, but it has repercussions that aren't so great. Well, sex is bad outside of marriage. Sex is also bad when you have alternatives to your sexuality in marriage. I really push back in relationships on the sense that pornography is acceptable. I know also in relationships that say that sex isn't as important as the relationship side, so instead of having sex and choosing that physical part of the relationship, there's the tendency to invest in relationships emotionally, be it Facebook, or just in conversation or books and wanting to read books and read romance stories. And I don't mean to be stereotypical, but men, if they struggle with pornography, they need to stop being passive and they need to talk to their wife and say, this is something that is a part of our marriage. We need to schedule it. And wives, if that's a challenge to be invested in the relationship, especially after the kids and later in life, then you have that moment to say, okay, this is what I need emotionally. I can't find it in a book, and I won't find it just looking on Facebook and posting and likes and all that. I need to be one with you. And it takes work. It's not easier as it gets older, but it is better. It's great. And it has to be great because it's a gift from God. For this reason, a husband will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they become one. May you share that intimacy in your marriage. May you abstain until you understand the joy of who you are and who you are that you are presenting to somebody else, and you find that moment in marriage. Amen.